Hi, everyone. Um, Thank you for joining us tonight. We'll get started. My name is Anthony Graham. I'm Senior Curator here at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. And I'm really thrilled to be joined by Zeinab Saleh, whose exhibition Signs of a Softer World is opening today. It's open. And yeah, just really. Oh, woo! Um, and yeah, I normally give a little bit more of a framework for the show, but I think it'll just be exciting to start talking. But maybe just as a little bit of a background, Zainab is a painter based in London, and this is her first one person exhibition in an institution in the US. And so we're really thrilled to be bringing her work to Berkeley and sharing it with you all. And really thrilled to have her exhibition as part of our Matrix series, which is a platform for contemporary artists to realize and debut new work that has been in place since 1978. And so this is our 289th Matrix exhibition. And yeah, I'm just so pleased to have worked on this show with Zainab. Um, and so with that, it's always so funny to have these talks in this like incredible theater and yet steps away from the exhibition itself. But luckily we have this giant screen and these beautiful photographs of these beautiful paintings. So the show includes 9 new works that are being, shown for the first time, all made from this year. And maybe as a starting point, I'd love to talk a bit about the title of the exhibition, which is Signs of a Softer World. And so I wonder if you could speak about a bit about it.
Totally. First of all, thank you so much for having me, Anthony, and curating the show so beautifully with so much care. I've had the most wonderful experience and so honored to show as part of the Matrix program, and yeah, feeling really blessed. And the title of the show, Signs of a Softer World, really for me, I was thinking about these kind of soft and tender moments that I'm depicting in the paintings, like that moment of the lone swan in the blue painting called Drift, and then the cat looking outwards into the scene in the painting closing ceremony. So those kinds of soft moments, but also the ways that I'm approaching painting with this kind of sensitive and delicate hand. I'm also, I guess, hinting at the possibility of another world with this title, and the hopeful kind of gesture towards there being something else other than this current world that we're living in.
Thank you. And I mean, there's such a serenity and sort of like beautiful calm to the paintings, but one of the things that's like so special about them is that the more you sit with them, the more visual information you start to see and really realize is there on and underneath the surface. And, you are such a process forward painter. And I wonder if you would, give us a bit of an overview of how you make a painting, because it is such a sort of like unique endeavor.
Well, I guess I'm kind of revealing my trade secrets, but
You don't have to reveal. You don't have to reveal all of them.
no, I'll share. But essentially, I will stretch the paintings first, and that's really important for me because I'm working with lots of watery washes of acrylic. So if I try and do that process unfixed, it creates these strange undulations in the linen, and yeah, it's got to be quite taut. So that's my first step, and then after I prime, I apply these watery washes of acrylic. And after that kind of wash happens, I will gather different materials, fabrics, textiles from different walks. And really, the gathering of those materials is also part of the process for me. And I create these pressings into the surface of the canvas. And leave them to dry, and come back the next day, which is always the most fun surprise for me. And I always really look forward to seeing, what's happened. I have to relinquish control and just see what the canvas is going to do. And then the next day, I carefully peel away at these objects and see how they've set into the surface. And for me, I really enjoy like painting in response to what's already on the canvas. And I find it personally really difficult to just paint from a blank canvas. So having something to riff off of is really generative for me. So that's what happens. And then I will go in with some dry brush marks. I have these moments of kind of like, these like soft diffused marks that I'll make, which have this dreaminess to them. And then that initial layer, or like the different layers of printmaking kind of, is a different register. It kind of suddenly jolts you back to reality. And then these two different mark makings kind of build up the worlds that I'm trying to depict in different ways. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've loved the way that you've talked about the impressions of the leaves being this jolt back, that like this is a real leaf. And it's interesting too to hear you talk about, the sort of imagining of new worlds in the paintings, but that they're of course so grounded in your experience of this world. And it's just, it's nice to think about the ways that we take parts of our lived experience in order to create something new. And I'm trying to think of where I was just going with that, but but part of it, what I love so much is the ways that the paintings are, grounded in this, in something very specific to you, but then open up into all of these other possibilities for the viewer. And one thing that is, I think, another interesting element, which you sort of hinted at with the process, is like the patience that it requires, that there's this waiting period, and I know that you work on several paintings at once. And so that sort of helps allay some of that, that waiting. But the other thing I thought would be interesting to talk about was that this body of work was made this year after you returned to London, having been away for a year. And so I wonder, could you talk a little bit about the year that you spent in Dubai and how that's, changed your process, and then what it was like to come back to London? You said this incredible thing in a past conversation where in Dubai, the paint would actually dry in minutes, wherein in London, you have to wait all night.
Yeah, I guess it really did speed up the process. If I would just turn off the AC, the temperature could reach up to 30 degrees in the summer, 30, 31. So it's incredibly hot. And actually the light of the city is completely different to the UK. Because it's a desert region, you have this incredible warm light. And I think it's because of the dust particles, but also the sand in the air. And there's this kind of soft haziness that the city has. And then, I made the painting the local game while I started it while I was in the UAE. And there's a real warmth in the painting. And I'm thinking about, the local games that were being played around the UAE. There's a big South Asian community, and Carom, which is depicted in this painting, is a game that originates from India. It's a tabletop game that it's kind of similar to snooker or pool or billiards, in that you aim to get your kind of discs into the corner net. So where the corner where the green circle is, you aim to flick your colored disc into that space, and with the game you dust talcum powder or any kind of very fine powder over the surface. And I always really loved that kind of texture, which helps the discs glide through on the plane. So I tried to use a lot of dry brush marks in this painting to kind of evoke that chalkiness of the game itself. And yeah, carom originates in India, but it's played widely across the Gulf and across East Africa as well, and as well as South Asia. And it's a really kind of special, very physical game. And I don't think I would have made this painting if I hadn't spent a year in the Gulf and had time traveling extensively through Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Oman, and really taken a moment outside of UK and my normal settings.
I'm sorry, I'm going off our script a little bit, but I'm also curious because to think about the ways that your travels and these real places have then like inform your practice and in these ways that, you know, aren't immediately legible. Like, you know, I know that this painting, for example, was, you know, followed one of these trips. And so I'm curious too, just thinking about how the landscape, you know, informs your painting practice, you know, whether it's depicting, you know, it seems like a place, like we could look at Drift after this, which, you know, feels like a real place, you know, that one could recognize. And then other places that are just so dreamy and really do feel like, you know, a space of imagination, and how you sort of move back and forth between those different registers.
Yeah, with all of my paintings, I'm kind of responding to my everyday spaces or like different kinds of experiences that have stayed with me. And from living and spending a lot of time in Sharjah, it's a city that really they built their economy off of pearl diving and the trade of pearls, and spending time with that history. I really came to kind of, yeah, spend a lot of time thinking about the like what's beneath the surface and the ecosystems um within the sea and the Pacific Ocean. And I made the painting three oceans away as well. And I'm just thinking about the distance between here and where I used to live in the UK in London. And in this painting, Pearl Moon, you have these kinds of moon-like shapes, but also pearl-like shapes. And then you have the surface underneath, which for me is this very aqueous, dense surface. And my husband and I went to Oman and spent some time snorkeling, and it was our first experience doing that. And I just became so so enamored with the underwater world. And I think this painting came about after that trip. And yeah, it's the one of the rare paintings where I have these two different kinds of scenes in one plane. And I think I definitely bring my like everyday experience through the paintings, and I'm working through things with the works. And yeah, for me, painting is also about slowing down. My process involves a lot of waiting and slowing down of time. And I think that I'm able to kind of process things through the act of painting, which for me feels like a real privilege.
Yeah. And also what I love about this painting is, I mean, in all of them, it's true, but I, your various techniques are really apparent in this one. So for example, with the leaves, just to like point out, you know, like, so here is when Zainab earlier was talking about like these impressions that get left behind by an actual leaf that is, you know, placed on the surface and then like very carefully pulled up. And that too is like another moment of unpredictability. Like sometimes the leaf comes up and takes all of the paint with it, and other times half of the leaf comes up, or you end up with a really perfect impression. Sometimes, a lot of the time.
Sometimes.
But then also, you know, there are other moments where you've painted leaves. And then there are moments where you've sort of masked out or removed paint, and there become the sort of trace of leaves. And, you know, I think what's so exciting to me is that, you know, in all of the paintings, there's kind of like the first glance where it's like, oh, there's leaves falling down the surface of this painting. But then you realize there are these, they're made in all of these different ways. There's these different registers of reality. There's the jolt of the impression that is like, you know, so intricately detailed. Then there's the gesture of a leaf, you know, which is sort of rendered by you. And then there's also like the absence of the leaf, but that's still suggested. And that all of these things sort of layer on top of one another to sort of create these different moments of the world, you know, that they're the different kinds of leaves. Oh, I could have just shown the next slide. I mean, one thing that, to return to our questions, that I would love to talk about more in depth is color. You know, for a long time you worked monochromatically and with charcoal. And you know, it's sort of incredible to see the way that color has opened up in your practice, even if in this like very refined and intentional way. But could you talk a little bit about how you approach color and how you started bringing it into the work with acrylic?
Totally. So I worked exclusively with charcoal for a number of years, and returning back to acrylic and color, I think I had a kind of heightened sense of what colors can do and the kind of connotations of each color. So I began working with very muted tones and a very limited palette, and trying to see what color can do in terms of creating atmosphere, because the charcoal works had this real air of like mysteriousness and like this kind of dark eeriness sometimes to them as well. So I still wanted to create atmosphere through the tones I decided to use. So for example, with these tones, there's a real like softness and airiness and openness to the greens. And then with painting Drift, which has a lot more really quite soft blues, which you can see in that. Yeah, in Drift, it's a very limited palette, and the blues, for me, I wanted it to kind of create this sense of calm and contemplation that you often experience in nature. So really working with color to try and evoke atmosphere. And then in the local game, in complete contrast, the yellows for me bring out so much warmth and joy that comes with like different kind of social practices, and like in games, and like henna as a social practice, which is depicted in that painting. And then Alone with Company, with the green and the purples, I wanted there to feel like there was almost an air of mystery or eeriness, and I really try and create different atmospheres through the colors I use and through the different paintings, which amplify what the other ones do. Yeah, in contrast.
Yeah. And also in this exhibition, charcoal has returned in two of the paintings. Can you talk about what it's been like to, you know, incorporate it back into the paintings and how it's different or the same, or how it's in the paintings?
Yeah, I did succumb to my charcoal tendencies with this show. So the cats are in charcoal, and for me, I love to use charcoal to depict cats. And charcoal is very tough material to control, kind of like a cat, and there's so much movement to it, and I really enjoy trying to depict softness and different textures in general with my paintings. I'm depicting the surface of the prayer mats with a kind of softness, and then depicting like air and atmosphere in different ways. So yeah, and then I also have charcoal in the cat for closing ceremony, and in that one I've also added some more charcoal. I've added some coloured pencils for the hairs, and amped up that kind of texture. And returning to charcoal in this way has been really nice and feels like more purposeful as well, and still allows me to use colour and these different textures.
Yeah. And, you know, another thing that, since we're on Alone with Company, you know, the other, you know, we talked so much about color and the real nuance of them between the paintings, which I think really comes alive when you see the show because it's so hard to do on slides, which is that the colors become so pronounced when you look at the paintings next to one another. Like the real variation of blue comes alive from one painting to the next, or the real intensity of how green that one painting is, like sandwiched between a more yellow and a more blue painting. But part of that's also this, modulation in how you compose the works, that some of them are somewhat more abstract and others are somewhat more figurative. And I'm just curious if you could talk a bit about that approach to how you compose the paintings. I know that some are quite, sort of centralized and others are more open and airy, and how that sort of like fits into the process.
Yeah, I think with, for example, the painting Love Letters, I wanted it to feel like this compact, intimate moment. It's the smallest painting in the show. And just like a letter itself, you have to kind of get up close to experience the work. And I think at the time I was also thinking about how these very ornate gates and metal railings across the Gulf are this act of like protection for your property, but also this gorgeous kind of like decorative softness to adorn your home. And for me, it's not just the gate, it also is like communicating something, but there's also quite cursive. And I really enjoy the curvature of it, and it feels like it's speaking to me. And I titled it Love Letters. And so I was thinking a lot about, how I love receiving letters and postcards. And I feel like it's almost a lost art, as so much of our communication is digital nowadays. And recently seeing the Suzanne Jackson show at San Francisco MoMA, I saw some really gorgeous letters and exchanges between herself and artists like Betty Saar and a whole host of different artists. And having those handwritten letters kind of, yeah, it brought back this human level of intimacy and tenderness, really having that kind of like human touch. Whereas sometimes I think, how are these communications between artists going to be, I guess, shown in maybe 50 years' time? Is it going to be text messages? Is it going to be screenshots of DMs? But then I'm sure that there will still be a nostalgia for that form of medium. But yeah, I'm sure it will kind of be like MySpace, of feeling like it's such a long time ago. But for me, letters are just timeless.
And then this other real rhythm in the show is between scale. So this is the most intimately sized painting in the show, but then there's a similar composition, kind of. Actually, they're totally different paintings, but they have one similar element, despite gray clouds. And could you talk a bit about what it was like, having made one painting and then making the other at this really different scale?
Yeah, so Love Letters came first, and I was really interested in how it could change with scale, and feeling like there was more space and room to breathe across the canvas plane. And the tones are really quite subtle. There's very subtle tonal shifts of blues and purples. And for me, I wanted it to feel like it was a more kind of like calming moment. And the purples, the blues together, it's these different kinds of shades of blue. And I think a lot about and read back and spend time looking at Derek Jarman's Chroma, and he writes so beautifully about color theory and memory, and he wrote that book while his eyesight was deteriorating, so he was remembering different experiences with different colors. And he has a chapter just on blue, and in that chapter he speaks about like the patina of copper, Egyptian blue. he talks about the blue of the mosque, once in a blue moon. And I think that for me, blue is such a rich color, and there are so many different tones that you can get. And I also think about, feeling blue, and there's this kind of sadness in Despite Grey Clouds, rhythm and blues, and listening to the blues. So even though some of the paintings feel quite monochromatic and very blue, to me, blue is such a rich color that communicates so much.
I agree. I think maybe my last sort of question before we open it up to the audience, you talked about this a little bit with the local game, but I'm also just curious, actually maybe another painting, there is, somewhat this kind of element of narrative that sort of beckons out of a lot of the paintings. It's never straightforward, and it's always sort of, eerie and mysterious. But it's sort of always structured around these moments of gathering, whether it's around a card game or a board game, or even like a walk around the park. Suddenly, like a park sort of feels like a communal place. Or the sort of mystery of this like beautiful banquet chair. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about not necessarily the narratives that exist in the paintings, but, the role of these sort of like communal spaces that often are suggested in your paintings.
So I feel like I also made a decision a while ago to always title my paintings, because I very rarely fully disclose narrative. So Closing Ceremony for me is kind of like, it could be so many different kinds of ceremonies and different chapters of one's life. So alluding to narrative through the titles is something that I'll do quite often. In titles, sometimes I'll reference books or poems. Like I've referenced Kevin Kwashi's Sovereignty of Quiet, and for me, I titled that for one of the paintings I had at Tate Britain, and it really did just it kind of worked for the themes that I was thinking about. And Kevin Kwashi speaks really beautifully about quiet as a metaphor for inner life, and for me in the studio, I'm kind of trying to bring that idea to material form in the paintings. And there's I guess narrative that's alluded to, and there's often a very familiar kind of object like a cat or a hand or the banquet chair, and that often I hope will bring in the viewer enough to see something that they can relate to, even if there are other moments in the paintings that are so specific, like the carom board, that they might not always recognize. I hope that there's still like openness so that people can, interpret the paintings in whichever ways they like, because ultimately, the paintings aren't didactic. It's coming from me, but it's not necessarily depicting a singular story. And that's what I love about painting, the fact that there are so many different readings of a singular work, and it's not necessarily telling you what to think.
Absolutely. Okay, let's open it up to the audience. We have mics so people will come and...
Hi, so wonderful to see you. When we saw the paintings, several of them depicted to us when we looked at them the passage of time, or maybe even the you're in the present and you're going into a past memory, especially like the Pearl Moon. I might be saying the wrong title, but it looked like time passing, perhaps the water flowing in time, or it almost depicted to us when we looked at it, the leaves had fallen from the top to the bottom or something. Do you think of that passage of time in your work?
Completely. And I feel as though like the painting holds those different moments of times, all the different layers, and through those kind of different marks, you have the imprint of the leaf, and then you have the kind of the representational drawing of it and kind of trying to grasp something that's no longer there, essentially thinking about memory. And yeah, I think the passage of time is really important within the works, because they take this moment of time and then they're of a fleeting moment of time as well.
Hi. Hi. I'm just wondering if you've ever spent time in a printmaking studio. You're speaking so many different languages or in the vocabulary of printmaking. So, yeah.
Completely. Whilst I was a student at Slade, I spent a lot of time in the printmaking studio, and I loved the printmaking process. That final moment where you, especially with soft ground printing, where you roll, when you roll and then you pull the blankets and you get to reveal the paper and see how a print has been made. That element of surprise is always something that kept me returning to printmaking, and I found a way of incorporating that in my paintings, which has felt really really exciting for me, because ultimately it's me that's going into the studio every day. So I need to be excited about my own practice and excited about the next day ahead. And I have never actually done cyanotypes, and it's something that I would really love to do. I feel like I'm trying to create cyanotypes in my paintings. But yeah, I've done lithography as well, soft ground, hard ground printing, screen printing. So for sure, it's a language that I always come back to.
And maybe just to spend a little more time on process, because I think it's like they're so beautiful. But and then you sort of see it in Drift. That actually, I wonder if in Despite Gray Clouds, it might be even easier. In the top one, can you talk a bit about how these like passages, which are really like, because that is kind of the printmaking like process, even though it's so subtle, these variations in tone and opacity that happen in the paint, and that's through fabric.
Mm-hmm. So that's through pressings of fabric, and I really enjoy the kind of act of creating tone through the removal of paint. So there's this kind of push and pull with the canvas, and I think that I really enjoy that kind of subtlety that can only really be created sometimes outside of your own hands. And yeah, I think it's about like allowing the canvas to do what it wants to do as well sometimes, and responding to that and allowing it to unfold in a natural way. And yeah, I do really enjoy the kind of subtle shifts in tone. For me, it feels like creases in time as well. And also like ripples of water.
Yeah. Yeah. I have two questions down here.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
I was like, I don't know. Hi, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see your work. I have a question actually about, like, you brought up Kevin Quashie's work, which is amazing, and The Sovereignty of Quiet, which is like a book in part about like the kind of quiet inside of like revolutionary gestures. It begins with that reading of a photograph of people, for those of you who don't know, who are like silently standing at the Olympics holding their fists, revolutionary gestures. And these paintings, you are describing so much process that involves like, like skimming, scratching, pressing things onto other things. Like they might be quite quiet, but there's a lot of like, I don't know, kind of like tactile engagement that is actually quite like forceful, even if it's like quiet pressure. And I'm interested, I guess, in if there's a connection for you between those two things. Like if like all of this sort of like, I don't know, like layering on of like abrasive processes has something to do with like a quiet sort of like revolutionary sentiment, or like a desire for another world, which is created out of like softer gestures that still have like quite kind of impactful afterlives or something like this. I'm just curious about it.
Oh, that's like a wonderful reflection, and I hope we can talk more later as well. I think in the works and in the gesture of painting and working with the medium of painting, which allows you to have so many different readings and is a rejection of a singular story of a person, or like a singular story of an experience, I feel as though I'm able to work against those kinds of like notions and like I don't know, those kinds of external pressures in that way, and resist those, using painting as a form of resistance to that. I'm always really keen to have multiple readings and embrace multiplicity, especially in a time where there is so much kind of censorship and this kind of push towards making things more simplified and easier to digest. I think within painting, I have this space where I can reject that and embrace complexity. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful and very moving exhibit. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about something you mentioned in the beginning about the dreaminess, maybe in relation to framing and borders within some of the pieces. I'm thinking especially of the 2 pieces of prayer rugs and the piece of the game. For me, I felt as though there was this other kind of coexisting reality almost reaching in from the outside in some of the pieces. So I'm wondering if you can maybe just talk a little bit more about these coexisting realities and how they show up in your work.
Thank you for your question. I guess I also use the motif of the prayer mat to kind of as a stand-in for the idea of like praying and thinking about another world and praying for another world. And in the act of that kind of quiet moment of solitude, imagining and thinking about the possibilities of change, and within yourself allowing that to be a reality that is something that you can wish for. I think that within painting, I try and create these moments of just like contemplation for myself. But I like that there is this dreaminess to it, but then there's always like these very like hyper specific moments of like of a leaf or a shape that grounds you back into the real world. And whilst we can dream, or we're still living in this material reality of where we are now. Thank you. I don't know if that answered your question, but thank you.
I have a question about technique, because my son that does some painting, he uses the traditional canvas. And I noticed when you were talking about this, you said the canvas, but earlier at the very beginning, you were talking about how you stretch the linen. So since I don't do painting, is it the linen has a finer weave? Is that why you prefer it for that series that you've done?
So linen as a material is meant to have more oil and is meant to be more flexible over time. So you would hope that there would be less cracking in a painting on linen than there would be on cotton, which is why I go with linen. And I think from speaking to conservators sometimes, linen seems to be like a better material to go for. But I think cotton is also great because it's so like it's easily found. You can go to a fabric shop and get a whole roll of cotton. But when I'm speaking about the canvas, I think I'm thinking more about the stretched surface. Yeah. Thank you.
So you've been talking a few times about seeing in the different layers the idea of either past times or a past in the sense of something that doesn't exist anymore. And the layers, I think, was what struck me most, as a common motif throughout your work. And do you are there other things that you think about when you do layers besides that? That they represent other sort of concepts or feelings, or is there also just something more direct of like just the fun of doing layers, I guess you might say, in and of themselves, just the interest that they have.
I think the layers come in because I'm trying to create like these more subtle, I'm trying to build these worlds more subtly, and I also really enjoy the kind of matte chalkiness of paint. So that's why there's these layers that keep occurring. I don't know. What do you think?
I think there's also this level. It's something someone has commented on, or a few people have commented on with, in Alone with Company, for example, or even with the Swan and Drift. There are these moments with like reflections and shadows, and that too becomes this like kind of incredible moment with more layer and more texture. And so, for example, if the charcoal is this, kind of rebel material that feels fragile and movable, what's so incredible in this painting is that it's actually the shadow, the like immaterial aspect of the cat that is like rendered flat and physical, but the cat itself could dash off at any moment. And I think in so many of the paintings, the layers and changes in texture and surface help to sort of build out not only just like the world that's pictured, but the sort of emotional world and the psychological world that unfolds in the paintings.
Completely, yeah. I love what you just said about that, the cat and the shadow. And Anthony, you've seen how the painting changes so much throughout the passage of time, and the layers that sometimes they can be seen, and then sometimes they're completely obliterated. And what's great about painting is that you could always start afresh, start a new layer, undo and redo. And yeah, I guess that's how it comes into play as well.
Okay, with that, thank you so much, Zeinab, for this show, and thank you. Yeah.
Thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank everyone for joining us.